This conference will now be recorded.
Well, thanks, Josh, and kia ora, everybody. Good morning. It's great to be here. It's been a while, and I bring the greetings of Western with me this morning. It's quite a powerful image, actually, that. I was looking at it to start with. I was like, oh, who's the one on the right? That doesn't look like God. And then I realized it's the Unforgiving servant, and I guess that's why it's been drawn like that, right? Because he looks pretty forbidding, doesn't he? Look, I want you to cast your minds back, if you will, a few months to the coronation of King Charles. Did anyone watch that when that was happening? A few hands are going. Oh, good. There's a few hands in here. It's went up right. I don't know about you. You cast your minds back. It was only a couple of months, but it was quite a striking ceremony, I think, in many respects for me. I was really surprised at how Christian that ceremony was. I don't know if any of you remember it, but it was basically all religion all the way through the ceremony in Westminster Abbey. And I read later on that it was actually mirrored on Solomon's coronation. King Solomon's coronation. So I mean, it made sense from that. But King Charles was even anointed. I don't know if you saw they put him. If you stay it that long, they kind of put him behind some covers and they anointed him. And so it was great. I mean, no one does pageantry and pomp better than the Brits, right? There was the grandeur of the occasion. There was the procession. There was 4,000 people in the procession, all started at the exact same time moving. It was choreographed to the nth degree. The music was fantastic. And I thought one of the things that really struck me was that the irony of this big, huge Christian service that took place at the Abbey. And then as soon as he walked out, with Camilla, with the Queen Consort, walked out, and they got into this golden carriage. Anyone see the golden carriage? There's a few people nodding, one or two. It was a really beautiful golden carriage, literally covered with plated gold. And 500 years old or something. You know, kings and queens from yesteryear have ridden their first ride in there after being coronated. And it was carved. On it was carvings of Roman gods and pagan gods. All and this fantastic irony. It was hilarious that they just had 2 hours of fully biblical talking of God and Jesus and everything, and they come out there and then it's like, here's the pagan gods that we really serve. But I'll confess I was conflicted watching the ceremony, the service of it all. I mean, I'm proud to be British. You know, I consider England still to be home, even after being here nearly 10 years. We support England in the football. I'm proud to be British and how I grew up and all that kind of stuff. But at the time of the coronation, it was really interesting because in all the British papers and media, there was quite a lot of protests going on at the monarchy, people not happy with the monarchy. And quite aside from the fact that there's the cost of living crisis going on at the moment in the UK, especially, they're really hard hit over there, and people are living from food banks and all that kind of stuff. And then almost £500 million or whatever it was, £500 million was spent on this coronation. An incredible amount of money that could have gone to helping feed the poor and people who actually needed it. And there was lots of kind of angst about it. But the other thing about the monarchy and the British Empire is that it's just that. It's a British Empire, and it's built actually on colonialism, right? It's built on colonialism, where the Brits went off and took over countries. And everyone in this room is aware of that. It's Matariki. We know about the indigenous people of New Zealand, but all over the world. I'm a product of that myself. The British Empire that Charles was being coronated on is this hugely conflicted one, as far as I'm concerned, because of the slavery and the brutality and the fact that it was created through this really unpleasant way. And so it was jarring to hear King Charles say that his first words when he was being coronated, his first words were, he came to serve as Jesus served. That's what his words are. I come to serve as Jesus served. It's very interesting. If you were going to do that, how did Jesus serve? He laid down his life, Charles. That's a big claim to make. And if he was really doing that coming to serve as Jesus served, he would be, making things right, reparations, all that kind of stuff, apologizing at the very least for how the monarchy was built on blood and toil and the slavery of people. And so I'm conflicted by that, and it brings me somewhat tenuously, I admit, but it brings me nonetheless to another king who I feel conflicted about, and that is the king and the focus of my thoughts today in Matthew, in the parable of the unforgiving servant. Pretty good couple of chapters in Matthew, that actually, by the way, wasn't it? They're pretty powerful. And one of the things that I've been doing recently at West, I say recently, for the last couple of years, is I've just been focusing on Jesus' stuff. Because I think it's really interesting. Like all the talks I've been doing at Western for a good couple of years now, always about Jesus and Jesus' teachings. And so I was reading through Matthew a while back, and this parable really stuck out at me, because some people will say that this is a very straightforward parable, and I suppose that's truth, right? And that there's one simple message associated with it, but here's the thing: in many ways, this parable is outrageous. It is incredibly mind-bogglingly outrageous. Nothing in the parable is as it should be, if you pay attention. None of it makes really any logical sense, and some of it is downright terrifying. And we know what this parable is about, right? It's about forgiveness. Obviously, it's about forgiveness. Forgiveness, a subject we've all heard 1,000 talks, studies, classes on, right? This is forgiveness. It's a key teaching point of Jesus, and there's good reason for that, right? I mean, they reckon estimated about 1/3 of Jesus's teachings are about forgiveness. So Jesus thinks this is important. So it is important. So it's understandable why people talk to us a lot. So it should be straightforward, right? But when you read it, it really isn't. Certainly from how I came to it. So we're going to just go straight into it here, verse 21. We get into the preamble of the parable. And Peter comes to Jesus and says in verse 21, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times?" Right. So some people think that this is top of mind because they think it's potentially around the time of the Jewish Festival of Atonement. And Peter is probably asking with his own brother in mind, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Now, look, the number 7 in the Bible, as I'm sure most of you in this room are aware, is a significant number. It can mean various things: completion, perfection, wholeness. And Peter's probably thinking he's onto something here. He's like, Jesus, 7 times forgive my brother? And Jesus' answer is very interesting. Verse 22, Jesus answered, "I tell you not 7 times, but 77 times." Not 7, but 77. And that's quite a perplexing response from Jesus. What does that mean? It's more than 7, that's for sure. So, okay, Jesus is, saying, no, it's not just 7. You've got to do loads more forgiveness than that. But is he providing this arbitrary number to make the point that you should just forgive a lot? And maybe, could be, that could be what's happening. But then Jesus does give this a definite ending point, 77 times. Now, in our house, with Zach and Esri, who get on very well most of the time, or some of the time, they have a lot of moments when they don't get on as well. And you can imagine, we're trying to teach them to, if someone does something wrong to you, you say sorry. The person says sorry to you, you say, okay, I forgive you, right? It's okay. But I could imagine in our house, be generous if we said to them, you 77 times, and then you're done. Zach's very good at maths, right? And I would be generous and say 2.5 weeks, he'd reach 77 times. And then he'd be like, Dad, I've done 77 forgiveness. Don't need to do it anymore. Jesus says. So is that what Jesus is saying? I don't think so. I don't think that's what he's doing here. I think he is quoting the Old Testament. And this is important for the parable. So this is why I'm just focusing on this for a second. And in particular, he is referencing Genesis. He's referencing something that happens in Genesis. And in particular, Genesis chapter 4. Now, we're only going to be really briefly, and I'm going to read it out so you don't have to go there. But he's quoting someone called Lamech. Genesis 4, verse 23. Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, listen to me. Wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. Why is he quoting Lamech? Well, you'll remember that Cain, who kills Abel, is given protection by God after killing him. And so Lamech kills someone and declares he will be avenged 77 times, which is to say, as humanity goes about living its life outside Eden, because mankind decided to do what was right according to their own eyes in the garden, right? In effect, Lamech becomes a manifestation of what happens when evil becomes a lineage, when sin becomes a family. Peter, Jesus is saying, you're going to have to outforgive evil, which is a problem for Peter. And if you think about it, it's a problem for us too, because Peter obviously thinks there's a limit to which forgiveness can be extended. And Jesus says, no, you have to outforgive evil. And with that point ringing in his ears, Jesus moves into the parable, verse 23. Therefore, kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. So this is the king who's doing the bookkeeping. He's at the end of the financial year, like we've just been. And those of you who are self-employed, run your own businesses, whatever, you all have been doing that kind of stuff, speaking to your accountants, preparing for the end of the financial year. And this king is checking his ledger. And he's looking down his Excel spreadsheet and he's reconciling the numbers. And here comes the servant, verse 24. And when he'd begun to settle accounts, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. Now, remember how I said this was an outrageous parable? This is exhibit 1. 10,000 talents, or depending on your translation, 10,000 bags of gold, or whatever your translation says, a single talent would be worth around 15 years wages of a laborer. Okay, 15 years of someone on a average salary. A single talent, one single talent. And this guy owes 10,000 talents. Make no mistake, the original audience hearing this from Jesus would have been shocked by this figure. The amount of money Jesus is talking about in this parable is more than the amount of money in circulation in any kingdom in Jesus' day. In fact, Herod the Great, who is widely recognized to be one of, if not the richest man to ever live, his annual tax return was 800 talents for the entire kingdom. And in the talent is the largest currency available, and 10,000 was the largest numerical designation in the Greek. I mean, in other words, the amount of money owed by this guy was unfathomable. It is indescribable. It is unmatched. It's like all the billionaires, gazillionaires, whatever in the world now, you owe how much money they have. It's an incredible amount of money. And this raises some questions, right? What kind of kingdom is this? What kind of king is this that he allows people to rack up such astronomical debt? The servant can't pay this. Surely he can't. Verse 25, since he was not able to pay, the master ordered he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. Told you, he can't pay it. And now he has to pay what's coming to him. Sure, doesn't sound very nice being sold to repay the debt, but they deserve it. They would have been living the life this year, right? They probably had a mansion with a swimming pool and a golf course. They probably had a ridiculously expensive yacht that they would go cruising around on. They probably had wonderful holidays and private school education for their kids. And meanwhile, here I am working away and picking up a meager amount of money each week. But I pay my taxes, because if you don't, you get sold as a slave. So serves him right. Right? Verse 26. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. Oh, no, you don't, my slippery friend. It is time to face the music, to pay the piper. Right, King? He can't pay you back what he owes. It's too much. His protestations are fake. Surely you see that, King. You see that, King, don't you? Make him pay for what he's done. Verse 27. The servant's master took pity on him, cancelled the debt, and let him go. What? Every single person listening to this parable is like, that's not on. And that should be our reaction as well. That's not on. He's been found out. He's been caught red-handed with his hands in the cookie jar. And it's not just any cookie jar, it's the biggest jar in the world, and all the cookies have gone and he isn't replacing them. This is outrageous. The kingdom's going bankrupt for this. Goodbye, economy. Farewell, prosperity. This is going to bring everything crashing down. You think your mortgage is going to be expensive when your renewal comes up? You wait till you're in this kingdom. Why? Well, it told us. The king took pity on him. He had compassion. His heart went out to him. Now, in the Greek, this word here is splagnitzomai. And you know what? Every time Jesus uses this word in a parable, the character does something to address whatever's going on. In the Good Samaritan, the Samaritan sees the man on the road and has splagnitzomai. In the prodigal son, the father sees the son return and has splagnitzomai. And here, in the parable of the unforgiving servant, the king has splagnitzomai. This is a word that in Jesus' view demands action. Often action that everybody else would see as being foolhardy, just like here. So what happens? Verse 28. But when the servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. This is an outrageous reaction from this servant. Outrageous. He doesn't even celebrate his debt being wiped. He goes straight out, finds someone who owes him a tiny amount in comparison, which is literally, by the way, around a millionth of what the man had owed the king, and grabs him by the throat and chokes him. And I think one of the important things to really think about here is what kind of man are we actually dealing with here? What kind of man is he? Because it seems like this guy is thinking to himself that he's pulled a fast one on the king. Oh, that king, he forgives me, but now I want my money. There's no regard to the fact that he's been forgiven his debt. He now sees himself as superior to others. He can't be touched, but all these other clowns, well, they play by my rules. Verse 29. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me and I will pay it back. Now, we have heard this before in this parable. It's almost word for word what the unforgiving servant said to the king, almost word for word. Both fall to their knees and beg, both ask for patience, both offer to pay the money back. And except the difference is on this occasion, this servant could probably pay the money back because it's very much a realistic sum of money. And so this parallel is here for a reason. And I think we're being asked to see the humanity in this situation. The mirror image, this mirror image should surely be enough for the first servant to see himself in the second. Surely. To see that they're not so different. They're both image bearers. That it's just a matter of degrees. Verse 30. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. So, excuse me, he either doesn't care or the forgiveness shown to him has not been fully accepted. Because this is outrageous. Has him thrown into jail, ignoring everything that's been done for him. He's fully off in his own world of right and wrong, as was Lamech, deciding what's good and evil on his own terms rather than God's. Verse 31, when the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. And so now here's the first outrage in the story. And it's the other servants who call out this outrageous behavior by the servant, and they tell the king. Where we get to the first part of the parable that is entirely reasonable. Verse 32, then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said. I cancelled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. Let those words sink in just for a moment. Because I think this is where it gets tricky. Where it gets a little uncomfortable for me. Yes, this king is well within his rights to do so. But I thought he was forgiven. This must just be a one-off, right? Verse 35, Jesus. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. This is challenging. This is challenging. If I don't forgive, I'm going to jail to be tortured. What if I want to forgive, but I can't? And I kind of feel like this is the part where I am conflicted. I know we often talk of forgiveness and mercy and grace. And I know it can actually be very difficult because there are some things that are really hard to forgive. And I don't want anyone to think that I don't recognize that, because that is the thing that has really given me difficulty with this parable. Some things people do to each other, as we all know, are awful, unjust, plain wrong. And they are difficult things to let go of and forgive. And things that may or may not have happened to people here today. I'm aware of that, and I want to respect that. I'm lucky. So far, I've not really had anything like that which has scarred me so deeply that it makes it hard to forgive. I get it. And so I want to respect that there are probably people here who are going through this very conflict for real, or at least you may know someone who is, or have heard of it, or encountered it. And so I think we just need to qualify here what forgiveness isn't. Forgiveness doesn't mean we have to forget or tolerate harmful behavior. It doesn't mean that once you've forgiven someone, you have to put yourself back in a position where the same thing could happen again. For a stupid example, if I get hit by someone holding a cricket bat, if I get hit by someone with a cricket bat, I can forgive him or her for doing it, but it doesn't mean I hand them back the bat and stop paying attention. Do you know what I mean? There should be boundaries and expectations and clear communication on what's right and acceptable. It's hard and it's messy and it's really difficult to let go. But holding on to things, these wrongs that have been done, doesn't do anyone any good. let alone yourself. And aside from kind of the theological implications, there's much more to the act of forgiving in many ways that is actually proven to be beneficial. People have done studies on this stuff to assess the impact of forgiveness. I found just 3 very quickly and easily. One study found people who were able to forgive reported lower levels of stress and had greater emotional well-being. Another found people who were able to forgive reported lower levels of physical symptoms and better overall health. Or the final study that showed forgiveness was associated with better mental health outcomes, including reduced symptoms of depression and anxiety. All of which implies that holding on to the anger, the hurt, the pain, and not letting go actually harms you. And so what are we to make of the end of this parable? How do we reconcile it with our understanding of the grace of God in light of the human condition and the fact that there is no eternal hell where you'll be tortured forever? And so we go back to the end of the parable from verse 32. And the master called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said, "I cancelled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had on you?" In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. First thing to say, this guy, this unforgiving servant, shows absolutely no regard for either being in the presence of the king or the supreme act of grace bestowed on him. Right? And I think that says a lot. It does seem to be about the intent of the man, how he views the world, what kind of world he is making through his own actions. He's definitely not someone filled with remorse, is he? I mean, he's not trying to find a way to make amends or to follow the king's lead, not at all. And in fact, what actually seems to be the case here is that the servant thinks he's beaten the system. He's tricked the king into playing his game, and now he's free to do what he likes. And the irony of it is that it's actually true, but not in the way that he thinks it. Because I don't think this is eternal torment or hell at all. And I think the best way to read it is that the king gives him over to live in that world that he creates, rather than the one that the king is offering. Because just as with Adam and Eve, who chose to define good and evil in their own eyes rather than trust God, the result of which is that they have to live in a world that is no longer how God intended it to be, where the ground has to be worked, where women labor in pain, where death and evil are rife, and Lamech, evil itself, is the result. So too, the servant is given over to live in his world that he creates, a world where the slate is not wiped clean, where the balance of the debt still exists, where the goodness of the king is not present, where splagmizomai cannot be found. The king has let him choose his own world, and it is a prison. A torturous existence where being in debt costs you your life. Isn't that what it's like, holding on to a wrong, not letting it go? It eats away at you as you hunger for vengeance. It's a prison you put yourself in. And when we talk of vengeance, you only have to think of Ecclesiastes. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. Or in Romans 12, where it says, "Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it's written, it's mine to avenge. I will repay, says the Lord." And Jesus seems to be saying, you aren't the person to deal with this evil. You aren't equipped. You aren't able. Forgive it. But don't worry, because God's got it. You can leave it to him to handle. And the second really interesting thing here is what it seems that the Greek lets you do with verse 34, which reads, "In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed." So firstly, the word for pay back here, which does mean repay, but can also mean release, forgive, or cancel can be read as until he should forgive all he owed. And so with that in mind, the question becomes, who is the he in the verse? Because you can also read the second he as referring to the second servant. So it appears it could actually be saying this: his master handed him, servant A, over to the jailers to be tortured until he should forgive all he, that is servant B, owed. Release what is owed to you, and you can leave the prison, essentially. Which is to say, he's handed him the keys to his own prison, which to me makes a lot more sense. And is exactly then what Jesus says in verse 35. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. You'll be living in the world without God and left to all the consequences that brings. It's in your hands. I mean, what is it that we are looking for when we are looking to right the wrongs done to us? When we're deeply hurt? It's a new life, isn't it? A life where that pain and memory is no longer there. Where that thing that's cut you so deep is no longer even a scar, it's just not there. A kind of resurrection. And I do wonder, do you reach a point holding on to pain and anger when we just have to let the crucifixion be enough? Maybe that's what we have to do. Not just for yourself, but for your debtor too. This outrageous act of sacrifice for you and me and all of us is enough. It will do it if we choose to live the life where God's path, where his mercy, his grace is enough to get us through these pains of pain and anger, these times of pain and anger. To look to a restored world, the new covenant, and the glorious kingdom to come. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. May God bless you, and may it be so.